Welcome back to the Podcast Digest, episode 161. We've got an interview for you guys this week. Before we get to our very special guest, returning special guest, welcome back to my co-host, Jason. Welcome back.
How's it going?
We're doing great. What have you been up to?
I still have a podcast. Still.
Yes, that's good. How's the new show going?
It's exciting. This week, when this,
I heard you had an amazing guest on it recently.
yeah, this week when this episode of the Podcast Digest drops, the Palmer Files will drop an episode with you, Dan.
Oh, I thought it was a good guest. Never mind. That guy's crap. Probably should still listen to it though.
Yeah, we just talk about podcasting the whole time.
Boring.
It's I really kept you on brand.
Who would want a podcast about a podcast? I don't understand. Anyways, speaking of great guests, we have one this week.
We do.
Indeed we do. This is a gentleman, actually, I believe for the first time ever, a third guest appearance, I believe, if memory serves, although it's been an extraordinarily long time, and there's been a lot to happen on his side of the world, and I wanted to catch up, touch base, and see what the ride's been like since his last appearance. So, Dana Buckler, welcome back to the Podcast Digest.
Dan, Jason, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's great to talk to you again, Dan.
It's great to have you back, man. We've got a lot of catching up to do. There has been big news that you'd set the Twitters a flutter in the past couple of weeks, and I was hoping to chat about that, but not just about that. And before we get to that, actually, I wanted to kind of go way back. So last time we touched base at any length, you were the host, the solo host of a little tiny show called How Is This Movie? One of my favorite indie podcasts that I still have a shirt for that I wear regularly in my closet. But a lot has changed since then. Let's start with How Is This Movie, Dana? Why does it not exist anymore?
That is a great question, and I was wondering if you were going to ask me that one because I wasn't sure that I had the perfect answer as to why it doesn't exist anymore. Other than I did the show for 5 years, consistently for 5 years, and I really I loved what I was doing. I loved doing the deep dives into the history of films and film franchises, and I loved doing the interviews. I'll admittedly say I was never crazy about the name of the show. And that was something that kind of bothered me from the beginning because to listen to the name of the show, it really sounded like just your standard movie reviews where I really, really transitioned more into film history. And I had sort of toyed with the idea of changing the name a few times, and it was suggested by a good friend of mine that, Dana, you're the host of this. People are getting to know who you are. If you're going to change the name of the show, just brand it as yourself. Just change it to yourself. Just call it the Dana Buckler Show. That way, if you call it the Dana Buckler Show, you can actually expand upon other things. You can continue to do the film history. You can continue to do the interviews. But you can branch out and do other things if you want. And so after the 5-year anniversary show where I had guest Phil Joanno on and we talked about my 10 favorite films of all time, that was it. After that, I said, I'm going to change it to the Dana Buckler Show. But given the fact that I was going to change it, it also gave me the opportunity to make let me say that again. Given the fact that I was going to change the name of the show, I thought that would be a perfect opportunity to try a few different things out. And as most solo podcasters know, it can be incredibly challenging to do a show solo week after week after week. And some of my favorite times were always when I was talking to other people. So I really decided that I want to start introducing a regular series of co-hosts on there. And so that's why, if you listen to the show now, there's really no solo episodes. I've got my good friend Mike Scott, my friend Ashley Shafley, my friend Kristen. And just between us, we sort of cover all the ground. We introduced a few different series like the 20th Century Movie Club. We introduced ongoing retrospectives like what Ashley and I are doing with the Vampire series. Kristen and I have been doing first-run film reviews, and as we're going to talk about in a little bit, we've introduced more interviews. So that was kind of the idea behind changing it. And I can tell you that eventually I want to expand beyond movies. And that's the core of the show. That's where it's always going to be. But I've got an opportunity coming up here relatively soon to talk to some really interesting people that don't actually have anything to do with the film industry, but I think would bring a lot of insight into what they're into. So that's kind of the long-winded answer to why I changed the name of the show.
Dana, I wanted to ask off the bat. I mean, there were a bunch of questions because I went back and re-listened to your last appearance on the Podcast Digest, which was 118, which I think was like 3 years ago. And in that, you start talking about history in this moment. Mm-hmm. Was that in the back of your mind when you renamed the show to make it a little, what I would call broader, so that you could do things like that?
Well, history in the moment was, and I remember I'm going back to that conversation that Dan and I had 3 years ago, and that was something that I was really going to take a serious swing at, of rebranding the show and kind of going in a completely different direction. But to be honest with you, Jason, I kind of decided to steer away from that because I felt like I was going to kind of trap myself into more of just deep dives into particular topics. And as much as I enjoy doing those, they're so daunting sometimes. They're 12, 14 hours of work just for a 30-minute episode. So no, the short answer to your question is no, that really didn't come into my mind when I was thinking about sort of broadening the appeal, but I certainly was strongly considering calling it that about 3 years ago.
And I just popped back into my mind. History of the moment. This was you replaying on the same abbreviations, right? That's what it was.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
That's where, exactly. Yep.
But, I got to ask you this. I'm doing a gentle, kind, fellow independent podcaster ribbing here, Dana.
Sure.
So I take this in the best intended way. But I just had this thought as you were talking about this transition and evolution of the show that you might be the only podcaster I know of who decides to rebrand their show, decides to self-name it. So you're operating under the Dana Buckler Show now. And with your self-named show, decide to bring on co-hosts.
Exactly. I figure
that makes you unique, sir.
Well, I thought about that as well. And I started to think about other hosts out there, and they, there are certain shows that are branded by the host of the show, and they have other people on there.
It's been done for sure. Yeah.
It's certainly there. I didn't set a precedent, I don't think. So I think I would sort of probably copied a few ideas there. So
the more serious question I had for you was I sort of knew we had talked, I think even directly before, directly after your last appearance here, you had been kicking around this concept even then. And I think before, after we recorded, we had chatted about a couple of different ideas. So it didn't necessarily surprise me because at that time, and even subsequent to that, you had started to interject all kinds of other things into the show, and including, and possibly my and many other listeners' favorite thing, and I want to know if these are still around because we're going to talk about how I've lost track of you in just a minute, but theater stories. There should be its own podcast or something. Where are we with the theater stories, Dana?
Well, we are. That's interesting you say that. I am currently working on one. As you know, Dan, and anyone that's listened to the theater stories, I wasn't going to the movies very much because I was having terrible experiences while I was at the theater.
That was the best part.
That was the best part. Now I can tell you that I was in Sarasota on Memorial Day, and I went to a movie, and on brand, of course, something crazy happened, and I am planning on hopefully getting that out in the next couple of weeks. So, but yeah, those ones, by the way, have always been I love doing the interviews. I love doing all of them. Those ones are the most fun to put together. Those episodes right there, because I'm just reliving these memories and these incredible things. And every single one of those stories is as accurate as I tell it. And it's one of those ones where people literally reach out to me, even to this day, like, you have the worst luck in the world. and I really do. And I will tease this episode just a little bit by telling you that on that same day that I saw that movie, Memorial Day of this year, I actually went to a Tampa Bay Rays baseball game, and all kinds of craziness happened at that game. And I ended up leaving in the third inning, and that's all going to be incorporated in that story. The theme of that story is going to be why you maybe shouldn't go to certain places by yourself. And I'll leave it at that.
And why nobody should ever hang out with you.
Exactly. I'll tell you a fun little story. So when Kristen and I were making the decision that we wanted to start looking at doing some first run film reviews, the first one on the docket was the Quentin Tarantino Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And she had a long conversation with me on the phone the night before about being a little uncertain about whether or not she actually wanted to go with me. She had proposed the idea of sitting in opposite twosies, me on one side and her on the other, because she was so concerned that something was going to happen.
Because you're not allowed to share twosies, Dana.
No, not at all.
That breaks the point.
Exactly.
Dana, about co-hosts, was it an adjustment? Because obviously a co-host is slightly different chemistry than a guest, and you have more than one. So did it take a while to get going, or I mean, is that why you selected the co-hosts you selected?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jason. So what I did was I put a tweet out that I had ideas of what I wanted to do, like the 20th Century Movie Club. I had that idea in the back of my mind. Like I grew up I was born in 78. I remember the 80s. I really grew up in the 90s. And I just remember that being a great decade of film for me. And that's where, some of my favorite films are from the 1990s. And I came up with this idea that I wanted to do a show that was solely dedicated to films that were released before the year 2000. And I also knew I wanted to do a lot of retrospectives and deep dives, but I didn't want to do it by myself. So I put a tweet out that I was looking for a couple co-hosts to join me for a few different segments. Now, I wasn't sure what type of response that was going to get. After a couple weeks, I had more than 400 emails, and it just got to the point where I want to apologize to anyone that I didn't get to. I got to the point where I couldn't even answer them anymore. And so I put a little questionnaire together, and I just submitted it to everybody that I could, and I got some really good responses back. And a lot of the questions on there were like, are you okay being on a show that where, it's called the Dana Buckler Show? To come back to your question, to come back to what you're saying, Dan, like I thought about all of that. And there were two that really stuck out to me. And one was Michael Scott and the other was Ashley Schlafly. And, we started emailing back and forth and we started texting. And then I just, spoke to both of them on the phone for quite a while. And after talking to both of them, I knew they were exactly who I was looking for. And it's been almost a year since I introduced the two of them, and I couldn't be more happy with, what they bring to the show. I think they're both amazing people, and I think they both bring fascinating insight to the show. So I'm extremely happy to have them on there. And then Kristen and I met about 5 months ago. I was at a restaurant and I overheard her talking about a particular movie. And I struck up a conversation with her about that movie, and we just started chatting, and I told her about the podcast, and she started listening to it, and we would continue to talk, and I loved the insight that she would bring. And one thing that's a little bit different is Kristen lives in my town, whereas Ashley lives in Texas and Mike lives in Houston. So I'm really happy with the three co-hosts that I have on here, and I was pretty happy with how all of that turned out.
Yeah, adding co-hosts can be an interesting ride, right, Jason?
Absolutely.
It's funny because I can appreciate just about everything you said there in terms of adding a different flavor to something you've done previously, and making sure you had the right person, and on a much more smaller scale, those were some of the things I had kicked around when I was looking at finally coming off of my hiatus. Before we get into what the Dana Buckler Show is doing right now, which is where I do want to go, I sort of got one more area I wanted to cover, which was something I'm not even sure if you even noticed. You've been a busy guy here lately, Dana. I did mention you on our last episode. Right at the end, we started a new segment about kind of what we've been listening to, what we've been into, that type of stuff. And I'd mentioned on there that I had lost track of you. And I did. And I'm going to guess I may not have been the only one. And realized that, and I don't know if it was my app or how it was set up or whatever, but I never unsubscribed to How Is This Movie? and then realized at some point via Twitter or something like that the show had become rebranded and it was new and stuff was coming out, and I had completely lost track of it. Have you heard of that with anyone else? Or I just kind of wanted to, one, confess that to you, and two, have you talk about that if you're aware of that, in case anyone else has maybe lost track as well.
Yeah. And I'm actually glad you brought this up, because it gives me an opportunity to address what happened. Because rebranding the show, and I'm going to get into a little bit of podcast, technical jargon here.
This is the place to do it right here.
Rebranding the show under no circumstances meant rebranding the RSS feed for the show. It was simply going to be a title change and a cover art change.
Right.
Now, I'm not going to get into who my podcast hosting service is.
Ruh-roh.
But I emailed them because, for podcasters out there, your podcast hosting service, they give you a URL, and I had inquired. Now, I didn't ask them to do it. I had inquired about, obviously, my URL was hitmpodcast.podcasthostingservice.com. And I had inquired about if I changed the URL, would it affect the RSS feed? Well, the response I got back was no, it wouldn't change anything. Couldn't have been more wrong. They couldn't have been more wrong.
Oh, boy.
What turned into a total nightmare. This happened in January of this year. And so I told him, can you change the URL to the Dana Buckler Show? And what happened? Well, that completely screwed up the RSS feed for iTunes and all the other apps that pull from iTunes. And I actually had to, one by one, email customer support for Spotify, iHeartRadio, every single podcast app, and have them manually put in my new RSS feed. Thankfully, iTunes was just sort of plug and play. You just put in a new one and it updated. But it was a complete nightmare. And I'm still dealing with it, Dan and Jason. I'm still getting emails and messages from people that say, hey, this doesn't go past the 20th Century Movie Club Volume 1, and we've done 19 of them.
Right.
And the thing is, I'm just going to be honest here. I would have dropped the podcast hosting service altogether, but that would have just meant starting all over again with another service. And thankfully, those who were subscribed via iTunes, there was some hiccups for the first couple weeks, but it eventually naturally sorted itself out. But it was, and to this day, I get a little upset just thinking about it. Like, I was mortified. I lost half of my subscribers in a week. Now, thankfully, those numbers have come back up and a little bit beyond that now. But it was a total nightmare. And the worst part of it was, and if I'm just venting here just for a moment, gentlemen, indulge me just for a moment. The worst part of it was the customer service and customer support with my podcast hosting service was non-existent for weeks. And so it was a complete nightmare. So that should answer your question as to why, for some people, I may have fallen off the map.
Dana, I want to talk about like something happy with the rebrand, which is the logo.
Yes.
It looks like looks like Jaws to me.
That's 100% what it was supposed to be. That is my favorite movie of all time. And I want to give a quick shout out to Tin Man, who is he's a YouTuber and podcaster in England. And he actually did the design for me. He offered to do it for me. He came up with about 3 or 4 different designs. And one of them, of course, was the Jaws inspired one. And I said, I love it. How much do I owe you? He said, it's yours. It's a gift. I love your show. And I love it. So thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. That was completely by design.
I mean, I guess the other question is like, were the others movie based as well? Like, because I'm always fascinated by like the almost.
They were all movie based. And some of them had, little logos from all the different movies I've talked about. And, they were all really well done. But of course, I'm very unabashed about the fact that Jaws is my favorite film. So that was the one that I was like, as soon as I saw that one, I'm like, I don't need to see anymore. That's the one. I love it.
Well, I enjoy the logo. It's a great logo.
Thank you.
Well, now we just need it on shirts so I can buy that one too, Dana.
Of course. Yeah, stand by on that one. Of course, Dan.
All right, we're going to get into the Dana Buckler Show and what's happening with it now. And, of course, the most recent big interview that you've got. Except I kind of want to talk about how we even got into these celebrity interviews. Towards the end of the how this movie run before the rebrand, there were folks like Jim Hemphill on the show, and there was a couple of others as well. And I'm kind of curious, take us through sort of where you are now to where you were then, and were some of these previous guests, kind of the key to making the connections into what folks are hearing now?
Well, I need to start. Obviously, Jim Hemphill is going to play a big role in the discussion we're going to have about with one of the most recent guests I've had on there. Jim was somebody that he was actually the very first person I ever interviewed. And this is going back to 2014. He had done a movie with Leah Thompson and John Shea called The Trouble with the Truth. And he had reached out to me and said that he was a fan of the show and wanted to know if I could send him the movie. And, wanted to know if he could send me the movie. He sent it to me and I watched it. I had him on the show, and he has been the most frequent guest on my show up until having those regular co-hosts. But as far as like a special guest, he's been the most frequent guest on there. And, I've had other directors on there, Phil Giuano. I've had Billy Corbin, director of, Cocaine Cowboys, and Ann Wells, and some really, really interesting people. And I'm just grateful that they would all take the time to talk to me about that. And I'm sorry, Dan, your question was sort of how did we get to where we're at now, or?
Yeah, I mean, will you feel free to drop the veil of what we've talked about. It was kind of spewed about at the end of the last episode. But yeah, just kind of sort of connecting, you were starting with, yes, some people obviously in the industry and people who had done some significant things, but not necessarily what I would say the average viewer would consider to be a household name.
Correct.
Except now that's kind of where you are at least starting to dip the toe into household names, not just with the current one, but then with the next one that just released, I think, this week.
Yeah.
And something tells me there's more of this to come. And I'm just kind of curious sort of what this bridge and road to get to that level has been like.
Well, let me tell you real quick. So, a couple of years ago, let me just sing the praises of Jim Hemphill, along with being a really, really good writer and filmmaker. He is hands down the smartest guy I know when it comes to film history and contemporary film history. He's somebody that I like to say I can reach out to if I've got a question about anything, especially obscure films. He's an expert on it. And a couple of years ago, I asked him if he would be interested in doing a recurring series called Icons, where we look at, like the title says, iconic actors. We Burt Reynolds, or directors. We did Oliver Stone. We did Wes Craven. We did Quentin Tarantino. And earlier this year, we did John Travolta. And like, I make no bones about it, John Travolta is my favorite actor. And Jim, that's the same case for Jim. Jim says his three favorite actors of all time: Clint Eastwood, Burt Reynolds, and John Travolta. So I couldn't have thought of anyone more that I would have liked to have had on the show discussing Travolta's career than Jim. So we do this episode. Now, I need to make it clear, I live in Ocala, Florida. John Travolta has a home here in Ocala, Florida. Now, I've never really met him before. I've seen him a couple times. He's not here all the time, but it's one of those things, he's a local celebrity. So when I did the episode with Jim, when we were done, I said, I don't know if it's ever going to happen, but I think, there's a possibility that maybe we can find a way to get this out to John. And he said, "Oh, that would be cool. That would be great." And we released the episode, and I made no effort to try to get it to John. I think a couple people here in town who knew him may have, but nothing really came of it. So I want to go back to August of this year, just about 2 months ago. I'm at a restaurant with Kristen, and I get a phone call from a friend of mine who works at a restaurant that I used to work at, a Prime Steakhouse that I used to work at. And he calls me and he says, "Hey, listen, I don't know how to tell you this, but John Travolta's people were here and they were looking for you. Apparently, John heard that retrospective that you did on his career and he really liked it, and he wants your phone number." And I said to my friend, "Well, did you give him my phone number?" And that was the first question I asked. And he goes, "Of course, yes, of course." And so I said, "Oh my God, well, that's amazing, and that's incredible." And so I hung up the phone and I looked at Kristen. We were sitting at a table and I said, "I don't know how to tell you this, but I think John Travolta is going to call me in a few minutes." And of course, that's like the biggest, like, "What are you talking about?" And I told her, I said, "Listen, he listened to the episode. He listened to it. And more than that, he loved it. He really liked it." And so we stayed up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning waiting for a phone call that never came. And so And we also, there was this, there's the thing going around that we all kind of have heard the story that John sort of stays up really late and kind of sleeps during the day. That's what I've heard. So we were trying to stay up as late as we could. And eventually I was like, I got to go home. I can't wait up anymore. So the next day we're at the recording studio. We're getting ready to do an episode and I get a phone call from a number I don't recognize. And I look at Chris and I said, oh, I think this is it. And I pick up the phone and it was John Travolta's assistant. And he was like, Dana, hi, my name's Ron. I'm John Travolta's assistant. I'm like, well, hi, how are you? And he said, well, I'm okay. John wants to know why you haven't responded back to him. And I said, Ron, I don't have anything to respond back to. And he goes, what? And he goes, hold on a second. And he looks at his phone. I imagine because I hear him sort of fumbling with his phone. And he goes, oh man, I gave him the wrong number. Hold on. and so what happens is, 10 minutes later, I get this very long text message from John. And it's just, Dana, thank you so much. You and Jim, you really got it. You understood my career, the choices I've made. And in the text, he says, hearing your conversation reminded me of the way Quentin used to talk about me when I was getting ready to do Pulp Fiction. And I'm reading this out loud and I'm just like, I can't believe this is happening. And so I respond back to him and I'm just, thank you, John. That's amazing. And we start texting back and forth for like a half an hour. And I'm just like, Kristen's like, are we ever going to do this episode? I'm like, I'm talking to John Travolta right now. We're just going to need him. and she, no, I'm kidding around. Like she was completely like, oh my God, this is amazing as well. And so, that's great. Great. So he really liked it. And that's end of story, I suppose. So what happens is, a week later, 2 weeks later, John's new movie, The Fanatic, comes out and it was happened to be playing locally here in town. So Kristen and I decided to go see the movie and we're doing first run reviews. Let's do a review of the film. Now that movie hasn't been getting the greatest reviews, but I can tell you that I and Kristen and I, we both really enjoyed the film. I think a lot more than the critics did. And we gave a very honest review and I would invite people to listen to it. So, I sent the episode to John and I said, here, by the way, we did a review of your movie. And he wrote back again, oh my God, you get it. I'm going to tell Fred Durst, who was the director, this is great. And again, we started texting with him for a couple hours. And that's, again, you'd think the end of the story. Well, a few days go by and I'm just sitting there and I'm going, I wonder if he would actually come on my show. Like, I wonder if he would actually do the show. And so I just texted him and I said, listen, John, I know you're incredibly busy promoting the film right now. And I know you were on Good Morning America yesterday and Jimmy Fallon tomorrow night. I said, but, any chance you might want to do the show? And he immediately wrote back and said, I'd love to do it. I'm not going to be back until September, but let's plan a date in September. And that's kind of how it got started. Good. And true to the, to his word, September 1st, I didn't wait. September 1st, I texted him and said, hey, here's the dates that I'm available, which, let's be honest, I gave him the month of September. Here's the month of September. He said, great, I'll get back to you in about a week. And then a week later, he picked a date and he said, now, how late can you record? And I said, well, whenever you need. He goes, is 1 o'clock in the morning okay? And I said, that's fine. And that just goes back to what they were saying about, he stays up late at night. And we selected a venue. Friends of mine, they own a restaurant and it was a place that was in the downtown area of town, a place that he knew where it was at. He knew how to get there. And, the day of, I texted him and I said, is there anything you need as far as food or specialty beverages, anything at all? And he's just said, I just like bottled water and iced tea and I'm looking forward to it. And he showed up at 1 o'clock in the morning and it was, my friend, Richard Barner and, my friend, and Kristen and John came in and Dan and Jason, I'll tell you, I didn't know if I was going to get 10 minutes with them or 20 minutes. There was no criteria laid out. Like I didn't know what to expect when he showed up, but I'll admit when he knocked on the door and I opened the door and you're staring at John Travolta, I got a little starstruck. And then the very next thing I noticed was that him and I were dressed identical, which was not by design. I was wearing a black t-shirt and jeans. I opened it up. He's wearing a black t-shirt and jeans. And he walked in and I extended my hand and I said, John, it's very nice to meet you. And he just gave me a hug and he said, Dana, it's so great to meet you. And I said, come on in. And I had set up the recording equipment inside this restaurant that was closed, and I got him a bottle of water, and he sat down. And again, I told you I didn't know if I was going to get 10 or 20 minutes, and we recorded for an hour and 45 minutes. And he stayed and hung out with us for a couple more hours after that. It was 6 a.m. before I actually got home and got to bed that night. Wow. But I'll tell you, it was an incredible experience.
I mean, I guess, first of all, I commend you on your, I guess, patience. Like, there's not a lot of people with a podcast that could text with somebody of that level and not immediately, like, after 5 minutes, just be like, you want to be on my podcast? Like, that takes a lot of, you know, I can't think of the word, but it takes a lot. But I wanted to ask, like, that's a lot of time to prepare.
Yeah.
Was it must have been different to prepare for that show versus any other. Did having so much time help, or was it too much time? How did that play out?
Well, that's interesting because Kristen had done the review with me of The Fanatic. Jim lives in Los Angeles. So Jim, it wasn't one of these things where I could just be like, hey, Jim, I need you to jump on the plane and come do this interview, because I just don't think that was logistically possible. But I'll openly admit I was super, super nervous about this interview. And John had mentioned, how much he appreciated what Kristen said. So I told Kristen, I said, I want you to do this with me. And so her and I, Jason, you're correct. We had a lot of time to prepare for this. And we really broke the research into 2 parts. Like, she was doing, and I commend her. Like, she did so much sort of background research on it. She went back and was reading interviews that he gave to Rolling Stone in 1978. Like, she went all the way back, and we had weeks to prepare for this. And I just watched a lot of his movies, and I had seen pretty much all of them, but there were some that I knew I wanted to talk about. And so I revisited a lot of them. And I would tell you, yeah, like, we had like 3-4 weeks to prepare for this, and it felt like the day of we're like scrambling, trying to figure things out, because it was just the weight of the fact that, one of the biggest movie stars on the planet is going to be on my show was really starting to hit me. And I'm like, I don't think I'm prepared. And I was probably, like you said, more prepared than I've ever been for any guest I've ever interviewed. And the ironic thing about the entire process is we had outlines, we had notes, we had pages, we had handwritten things, we had everything. We had none of it when we actually did the recording. We didn't even put any of it on the table, because I think we just felt like we wanted to have the most organic conversation possible. And when you listen to that, like, understand, like, with the exception of the part 2, which will probably be released 3 or 4 days from the date of this recording, I wrote down the name of some of his movies just randomly, and I asked him a question or two about each one of those movies. But other than that, we had nothing in front of us. We wanted a pure organic conversation. And I think it really does come across that way, especially with him, because he gets into things that we never anticipated he would ever talk about, stories about certain movies that we would never have thought to even ask him. So yeah, there was a lot of preparation, but at the end, I guess it was more like studying than actually having like a prepared outline for the show.
Oh, man, I'd have had a heart attack, Dana. I really would have. So kudos to you for staying alive. I want to go back to something you said earlier, just as a quick comment and an aside. If I heard you correctly, you said John Travolta's people showed up to the steakhouse that I used to work at looking for me. How did they even find that out? That's what I'd be wondering. Like, they found out where I used to work?
Well, because one of my friends that works at that restaurant knows one of Travolta's people.
Oh, okay.
And Travolta had been to that restaurant a few times. I'd never waited on him or anything like that. So it was just one of these things where I think Travolta had just said, "Hey, listen, this guy's local. Can you track him down?"
Gotcha.
I'd really like to talk to him. So
it wasn't like his people had like, CIA type connections.
Sure.
To figure out.
No. I think it was probably a couple phone calls, and probably somebody said, "Oh yeah, he works at that restaurant," which I don't anymore, but I worked there for 10 years. So it would have made sense that, hey, that's where this guy's at.
Gotcha. Your first text, I mean, You said it. This is arguably your favorite actor of all time. And you just got a text from him. That's got to feel... Forget about the show or the booking or the interview. That's all big deal stuff too. But this first text had to just be mind-melting.
It really was. And because the thing is, I wasn't looking for any type of validation for the show, the episode that I did on John's career. If you listen to that, like, I'm a fan of his. I'm a big fan of his. And I was delighted just to do an episode about him. It was one of those ones that was on the list of like, we're doing icons. We're going to do John Travolta. And in the back of my mind, I'd always wondered, like, I wonder what would happen if John ever listened to that. Would he appreciate that? Would he get in touch with me and be like, no, you were wrong about this, or you were wrong about that? Like, these little fears creep into your mind a little bit. But when I got the text message from him and what it said, it was what it said. Like, Dana, Jim, thank you so much. You guys get me more than anyone else. I mean, it was just one of these, like, it wasn't that I listened to the episode. Thanks a lot. It was, I listened to it. I loved it. You guys did an amazing job. It was such a surreal moment. I could getting chills thinking about it right now.
Dana, that story is so organic, but as far as the show is concerned, how do you come up with the what and the whom for, the movies or the interviews you're going to be doing?
Well, I'll tell you what's happened. Let me just touch on I'll talk about the part about how do we come up with the movies. A lot of times, like, obviously 20th Century Movie Club, sometimes we come up with themes, movies from the 60s, horror movies, things like that. And we just have a lot of fun with that. We don't discuss our picks with each other when we do those episodes. With Ashley, her and I, we do the film retrospectives for the most part. We did everything from Showgirls to RoboCop to this ongoing evolution of the vampire series. And honestly, most time, her and I just kind of kick around ideas. And if she comes up with something good, I'm like, that's great. Let's go with it. So it's kind of a collaborative effort with that. With Kristen and I, we like to do the first run film reviews. So it's really just a collaborative effort on what do we want to go see? Like, we're going to go see Joker tomorrow. We're going to do an episode on Joker tomorrow. Now, with the interviews, what's happening here is obviously this John one happened really, well, you've heard the story of how that all came together. Hang on, gentlemen, just bear with me for 1 second here. I have a really good friend of mine. He was actually with me at the Travolta interview. His name is Richard Barner, and he is the CEO of Global Pictures Media. Known him for years. He lives out in LA, and he has been really helping me as far as helping the show and sort of helping to build sort of the behind the scenes and helping me get a lot of things in place. And he's been really instrumental in helping putting some interviews together. And I have a kind of a funny little story to go with that. He called me a few weeks ago. This is probably a week before the Travolta interview was scheduled. And he said, listen, would you like to talk to Peter Facinelli? I think he'd be a great guest for the show, and I can make that happen. And would you like to talk to him? And I'm a big fan of Nurse Jackie, and I think he's great in that. And he's been in the Twilight films. And of course, he was Mike Dexter in Can't Hardly Wait. And I said, I'd love to talk to him. And so 10 minutes later, I get a text message on my phone from Peter Facinelli. He's like, hey, Dana, this is Peter. I'm a good friend of Richard Barner's. And, he's mentioned that, you might want to have me on the show, and I'd love to do it. And I said, great. This is great. And so I said, Peter, let me text you a few dates and let's do it. And I'm so wrapped up in the Travolta thing. And I send all these dates to him, and he comes back and he says, all right, well, the 23rd would work perfectly. I said, great. September 23rd it is. And so I text Chris and I said, hey, Peter Facinelli's coming on the show. Let's get together. Let's do a little research on him. Let's watch some Nurse Jackie, and this is going to be great. This is going to be a great conversation. She's like, when's he coming on the show? I said, September 23rd. And she, that's the same day you're doing the Travolta interview, right?
Double.
And I went, that was like through text messaging. So I call her and I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. are you serious? And like, I was so lost in like what day it was and things like that. And so that Peter Facinelli interview that was just released was recorded 4 hours before the Travolta interview happened. And so if I didn't have enough on my plate as far as trying to prepare for Travolta, because I wasn't going to text Peter back and be like, hey, listen, how about a different day?
John Travolta's bumping you, Pete.
Yeah, so that's how that all comes together. And again, I want to keep mentioning my friend Richard, because he's really helping me get together a pretty good list of people. We've got a lot of dialogue opened up, and I'm not ready to announce any names just yet, but there's going to be some pretty, I think, interesting guests that are going to be on the show in the next couple of months.
I mean, have you even had the chance yet to stop for a minute, Dana, and realize, like, the first time you were ever on my show, you were a guy watching movies and talking about their background and history. And you were doing a lot of work with it, but it was, I don't know, other than like the early hit 'em versions with co-hosts. I mean, this was such a solo project. There was an interview here and there, but there was, correct me if I'm wrong, at no time a prospect of large A-list actors and directors sitting down with you for an interview. And now that's actually happening. Have you even like allowed yourself to sort of process what's going on here?
Yeah, I'll admit to taking a moment or two and saying, holy bleep, I can't believe I had John Travolta on the show. I can't believe I've already had Peter Facinelli on the show. Like, I can't believe that so-and-so has said yes and they're going to do the show soon. Wasn't planned. Dan, Jason, it wasn't planned. Like if you would have told me 3 months ago, hey, in the next couple of months, you're going to start interviewing, you're going to get an opportunity to chat with, this person, this person, this person. I would have said, well, I don't even know how to start that process. I wouldn't even know how to begin that process, but it just through a series of events that I couldn't have foreseen, it just started to happen. And I'm really, really excited about what's going on. But at the same time, I'm also like, how do I, keep this all together? I thought I was a busy guy before is what I'm saying. Like, I thought I had a lot going on before.
'Cause it's on now, Dana. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's on now. You have a documented, long form, well-received conversation with one of the biggest names in Hollywood. So now, hypothetically, if you wanted to reach out to just about anyone, you will have this on your resume, and they're going to say, well, John Travolta sat down with him. Sure, I'll do that show. I mean, and I know that's not 100% type thing, but I'm just looking back at my little world of podcast booking. I had Phoebe Judge from Criminal on very early in my run, and that was such a valuable experience for me, because now most people are like, well, if Phoebe Judge would do it, then yeah, I'll come and join this guy. You've had John Travolta.
I was very lucky on that one. And I'm going to tell you, we've had that discussion about, okay, we've had John on, and that was an amazing experience. And by the way, I was texting with him 2 days ago and said, hey, because he texted me and said, I listened to the first episode. It was great. I really appreciate it. Thanks for letting me, be on the show. And I'm like, no, thank you. By all means, thank you. And I said, love to have you back on. He goes, oh yeah, we'll definitely do this again. I'm looking forward to it. I'm very, very grateful and I'm very humbled that he did the show, because I think kind of what you said there is, I think that might help me open the door to asking a few other people. And I have asked a few other people. Yeah. I see I'm getting a little tongue tied here, because this was not what I had planned. With the trajectory of the podcast, this was not something that of course I would have loved to have talked to people. And I have a list of people that I would love to talk to, but I was always like, well, I wouldn't even know how to start that. Now I feel like kind of like you said, I feel like I've gotten that first stepping stone and that opportunity to reach out to other people and say, hey, I'm genuinely curious about the industry. I'm genuinely curious about what you do. And I'd love to have you come on, and please feel free to listen to a few of my other episodes. You can look at some other guests I've had on if you need an example of, what the conversation would be like. So I'm thankful and I'm grateful that I've got those two really good interviews that are up there, and that yeah, like you said, for lack of a better term, sort of a resume for other people. And, you know, I've used that. I've reached out to a couple people and a couple people have said, yeah, I'd be interested. Let's talk a little bit more.
Dana, is the future plan just keep up the momentum, or because obviously you had a plan, and it's not like you were never going to get to, you know, bigger names. You're there now. So, I mean, does that all double the plan, or are you pretty much just speeding things up? Like what's coming next?
So what the idea is, and, you know, in between the Travolta interview and the Peter Facinelli interview, Ashley and I just recorded the next part of our Vampire Evolution. Mike and I recorded, you know, volume 21 of the 21st century, volume 21 of the 20th Century Movie Club. Kristen and I are going to see Joker tomorrow, and we're going to do a review of that. So I have not said, well, the rest of the show has to go on hold. I'm going to continue doing these series. It's a little more challenging and a little more time consuming, but it's worth it. And I'm just really going to focus on, you know, who is the next guest? What do I have to do to prepare for that interview? And let's see what happens after that. I mean, that's the only mindset I can look at right now is, you know, be prepared for the next episode that you're going to do. And if opportunity presents itself, listen to that opportunity, look at that opportunity, and maybe act on that opportunity. But that's the only way I can look at it right now. I mean, do I have this long-term vision of what I'd like to be doing? Yes, I do. Does it involve me possibly moving to another city and maybe opening up a studio a la what Joe Rogan does? Yes, I have that idea in the back of my mind. And it's something that I think about a little bit more now. So that's, you know, that's potentially what I want to be doing. And there's no time frame on that. These interviews haven't expedited that thought process. It's just like, well, that's eventually what I want to be doing. And what can I do today to get me closer to that goal? But nothing has changed as far as in the short term. Like I have not made any drastic decisions. Like, okay, this is it. I'm on. I got to go. I'm going to Los Angeles tomorrow. Like that's everything's still sort of status quo.
You know, what's interesting here is I was thinking as you were sort of telling that story, Dana, or going through everything, is that one of the reasons I think that John took to your Icon series on him, or the movie review, is that you have always done this with How Is This Movie through today, is that you come at these movies and stories, if they're kind of going backward looking in the history, and you sort of look at each movie as a story, and you tell the story to the audience. And I don't believe that a lot of these actors really have the opportunity to actively hold a conversation in the area that you bring that conversation to. When they talk, at least with the first, you know, these first several folks, or even going back to Jim, these people are talking the industry with you and their personal experience. You're not there as a promotional vehicle. You're not there, gathering gossip. You're not there to shoot pictures or pull out dirt or anything like that. And these folks face that all the time. And you come from such an honest place and a wholesome place, if you will, in terms of you actually want to talk about their craft, their experience, their thoughts, their ideas. And I don't think a lot of these folks have that opportunity to talk about that all too often. Now, podcasting as a whole has given a lot of these folks opportunities to do that more so. But I think, you know, that a lot of the shows out there that are giving these celebrities that opportunity to do that are the ones who are starting to have their names well received and are places that celebrities want to go. I mean, I think about Dax Shepard with Armchair Expert. I've been starting to listen to Justin Long's show from Wondery, and these folks that are giving these long-form conversations to celebrities that you just can't hear elsewhere. And I think you're playing in that area, Dana.
And that's honestly, I'm glad you mentioned all of that, because that's from the day I started the podcast, which 6th anniversary will be November of this year. I did it from a place of being genuinely curious about this industry that I have loved my whole life and that I've embraced my whole life and that I am just a fan of. And I'm genuinely curious about everything that has to do with this industry. And when I had John on, when I had Peter on, when I had Jim and Phil and everyone else on, these are questions, the questions I asked they were questions I wanted the answer to because I was genuinely curious about. And I was just delighted with how open John was about all of the questions that I asked him and the stories he told. And that's what I want to do. So yeah, I appreciate you sort of bringing up those points because that's exactly what I want to do. I don't want to do ambush interviews. I don't want to do clickbait stuff. I don't want to do anything for views or listens. I want to talk to these people. I would have been content to spend an hour on the phone asking John these questions and just having the answers one-on-one. One of my favorite things I ever did was I spent 4 hours on the phone with Phil Joannou one time. We had a great off-the-record conversation about all these incredible things he's done in his career. And I love that. I love that. And so to be able to record some of these conversations, I think is just amazing. And it's something that I hope to continue to be able to do for a long time.
I think the genuine nature, not only in which you interview, but the way you story tell, is probably your most endearing factor. I haven't listened as in depth or as long as Dan has, but from the shows I've sampled, I mean, you're genuine. I mean, that's the best word, and it's a great word to have, but that's the best word I can come up with.
Well, I sincerely appreciate you saying that, Jason. Thank you very much. And I try to be, always. So yeah, thank you.
His interviews are great, Jason, but go listen to the theater stories. Seriously.
Sure.
Love those. The theater stories are the best. Forget John Travolta. Nothing compared to a theater story.
That's
or
awesome.
Something along those lines. Well,
sure.
I'll tell you what, Dana, what's really interesting to me is this concept. And this is a little highfalutin, and this is like a little over-the-top storybook or maybe movie quality, so maybe it is fitting. But this little earworm in the back of my head just started talking to me and thinking to myself, you grew up a movie fan and a John Travolta fan, and movies and your passion and fandom for that has brought you so much, whether it be the personal experience, the talking with friends, the podcast itself. Your fandom of movies have brought you such an experience up to this point. And now at this crossroads where you and John Travolta were able to sit down for hours, and like I was mentioning before about a potential launching point or resume builder for other future conversations, it's almost now as if, you've now been able to get something that you've been giving the movie industry so long. This concept where it's like you've put so much into it, and now it's almost as if the movie industry is giving something back to you, where it could now be like this launching point for a total different trajectory for you. And I know you don't want to go that far. You're not thinking about that. You're kind of head down looking at the current docket of upcoming episodes, and we'll see what happens. Yes. But just to imagine and believe for a second, the movie industry may have just given you back or given you an opportunity to take things in a completely different direction. I mean, Conan has to retire someday.
Sure. Sure. Well, that's just a comment on Conan. He's my favorite. I love him. So that's.
Oh, see, you love Travolta, and look what happened.
Exactly. Conan. I mean, I get lost in the YouTube rabbit hole of Conan videos. So that's awesome. I just have to defer to what I said about as far as, and that was really nice what you said. And I think about it. If I'm being honest, I do think about that. But I also have to just put my mindset in, okay, so what's the next thing I have to do? But yes, I certainly do think about that.
Don't forget about us little people, Dana. That's all I'm saying.
No. It's never going to be like that. I promise.
This is recorded. I just want you to know we've been recording.
Of course. No, I'm so thankful. I gave an interview a couple months ago for a website out of London. And one of the questions, and I'm going to paraphrase the question, paraphrase my answer, where, he said, what's something that happened that you weren't expecting when you first started the podcast? Like what's something that came out of this that you never foresaw, that you never were able to foresee? And my answer is the same today as it was, a year after I started the podcast, and is when I wanted to do this show, I wanted to share my love of movies and movie history and all that with as many people as possible. And what I never foresaw or never was able to foresee was the amount of amazing people that I'd have the opportunity to meet and to talk to. And I don't mean necessarily meeting John Travolta and Peter Facinelli and some of these. I'm talking about the amazing people that I have emailed and text with and Twitter DM'd with over the years from all over the world, who I still, communicate with on a daily basis in some cases. And the connections that I've made, and all podcasters out there know exactly what I'm talking about. That's the best part of this entire experience. I still, almost every day I get Facebook messages from from different people who want to share, an article about a particular movie I talked about. Did you read this, Dana? Have you seen this? And I'm always quick to answer back like, yes, I have, or I haven't. I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much. It's meeting everybody. It's meeting you, Dan, meeting you, Jason. That's what this is. The whole experience has been. That's the best part of this whole experience, is just meeting people from around the world who share the passion for what we do.
Yeah, but you talked to John Travolta.
I did get an opportunity to talk to John Travolta. That I did. Yes, I did.
That has to be slightly off. No, I'm with you. And it's funny because I remember when you were in sort of, our little sphere, you had Annalise from Dark Angels and Pretty Freaks on talk about Skywalker Sound, as a guest on How Is This Movie? So, you were definitely, we helped bring you up, and now we've launched you into the stratosphere.
I am grateful for everybody who has been, supportive. I still reach out to Annalise from time to time. She's still an amazing person. And I look forward to having her back on the show sometime, and Annalise, I'm sure you're listening. I'd love to have you back on the show sometime. She's just one of those great conversationalists, and she's funny. And you're bringing me way back to, 2014, 2015. Those were really fun times. We were all just sort of getting started with this little experiment that was podcasting.
Yeah. Dark Angels, still Jason's Sunday morning listen, right, Jason?
Every Sunday morning.
Absolutely. If I have one regret is Annalise and Neil, we had talked about it 20 times about me being a guest on that show, and it just never happened because they would always record on a day when I was working. I would have loved to have been on that show. Hint, hint, guys, if you're still listening.
It's still there.
I know it's still there.
It retired briefly.
It retired for like 6 weeks.
Yeah, and I watched that YouTube live, the final episode. I caught on the last bit of that.
So I fell for that marketing ploy too.
So Neil and Annalise, I'd still love to be on the show. Just saying. So
Dana, is there like a book coming? Like, when's this story of Dana coming to? I mean, obviously it's out there in every podcast episode and in every guest appearance like this, but there's got to be some narrative that you can put together for us, right?
Well, there's a saying that I like to use. Kristen and I, there's a saying we like to use when we're talking about the podcast, and I think it applies to what you just said. And I always like to say to her, when it comes to this show, I don't know how the story ends, but I love how it started. And that's kind of where I'm at right now with that is I don't even know what's going to happen in 2 weeks, but I'm excited about it. And eventually someday I'll have to, for posterity reasons, put this all together because it's been quite a ride over the past 6 years. It's been quite an experience, and I'm really, really excited about the future.
For the record, Jason is a writer. I don't think he's done a biography before, but stay in touch.
Sure, of course. Of course.
I think that's going to do us for episode 161. Dana Buckler, thank you very much for making, I believe, your third appearance here on the Podcast Digest. Maybe your last without having to go through an agent, but I appreciate your time once again, and for the record, statement of fact, I am now, and I've double-checked this, fully subscribed to the Dana Buckler Show.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Dan. And Dan, first let me say, Dan, you thank you for everything. You had me on your show way back when, and I was so grateful. And I was so grateful that you had me back on again, and I'm so grateful that you had me on today. And Jason, it was a great opportunity to finally get a chance to chat with you, and that was awesome as well. So gentlemen, I just really, really appreciate you taking the time to let me ramble on for a little bit.
The pleasure was ours.
Great stories. Absolutely. If I had a 6-hour episode format with multiple parts, we could do this till 6 a.m. I'm sure.
Sure.
But folks, that will do it for episode 161 of the Podcast Digest. Links, real, actual working links to the Dana Buckler Show are in the show notes, as well as Dana's socials. So make sure you follow him and listen to this show. If you've not heard, start with John if you want, and then seriously go back and find those theater stories. I'm telling you, I've literally laughed out loud in my car. I remember so many times where I just couldn't even contain myself listening to these poor stories of Dana's experience at movie theaters. It's worth it. So until next week, folks, when I imagine we'll be back talking the news, for Jason and I, this is the Podcast Digest.